Going live. Okay, I'm going to mute myself.
Oh my God.
Is there a problem, Stan? Everything looks good here.
Yes, that's all right. Good. Now, where should I be looking into the microphone or should I
Into
be
the
looking
camera.
higher?
Into the camera, it's now lower down. I think the camera is at chest level.
All right.
Great. We're live now, everybody. So we've got, let me start the timer. I'm going to share my screen.
Set it to 9 minutes if you can.
I will do that. I just have to move this out of the way. And we're going to go. How's that, Jeff?
That's good.
Okay, great.
Stanley,
So we are,
do you need some water with you?
I have some right here.
Is it enough? Okay, because you're gonna talk a lot,
Okay, thank you. That's
you know?
fine.
Yeah?
You're thinking, thank you.
Anything else I can
Oh,
support
you've
you with?
been really helpful. I think that does it, right?
I think so. I'm excited. Are you excited?
That's what?
I'm excited. Are you excited?
I'll be excited if things actually work.
They will work.
Dan, it's
everything-
working.
This way or another.
It's working. We're live, Stan. We're doing the countdown. We can see you beautifully. And our audience is joining and starting to put questions in the chat for you. In 8 minutes, once this timer is done, Jeff will introduce you and we will start fielding questions from the audience. And yeah, thank you for your help.
Yeah, I'll be off your way. Nice meeting you.
Nice
and
meeting
good
you. We'll
luck
go
with
for
everything.
we'll go
And
for
thank you
90
so
minutes.
much.
Yes.
Yes, I'm glad you dropped by. We should not have done this without you.
Of course you could. I'm
Okay.
just, yeah. I'll keep in touch with you, okay?
Okay, good.
Good luck, everything.
Okay, Ted. So long.
Okay.
I'm moving my mouse out of the way, but the bar is still there. But anyway, I don't know why it's doing
Are you
that.
eating this? Can I leave you some of this?
Emmy, is your mouse
From the
completely
tree.
Just a minute, just a minute.
off? Huh.
Are those great?
I'll go to, maybe I'll try over on the other side and see. I don't know.
It's not grapes. Here.
Not right now.
I put them there in the kitchen, okay?
You can,
Are
In the
you,
kitchen.
yes.
Adios.
Okay. thank you.
adios. Emmy, is the, I bet the countdown clock is on full screen.
Yes, it is.
That's why you can't get your mouse out of the way.
Oh, should I stop sharing for a minute and then
No, let's just let it run.
leave it? Okay.
Obviously, you couldn't take your mouse above or below, I suppose.
Oh, when I go to the right, I go to the bottom. Whoops. Yeah, it just brings up my bars, but that's
Yeah.
okay.
So in the future, I would not make it full screen. I would make it large, but not full screen.
I see what you're saying.
But for now, this
Okay.
is fine. We're accomplishing what we need.
Yep, good. And people are joining and starting to put questions up, so that's great. So earlier I was complimenting you on your hat, Stan, and you were saying that it's the mascot of, did you say which university in Wisconsin that you and
The
Jeff?
University of Wisconsin, Emmy.
University of Wisconsin. That's what I thought.
Yeah, Stan and I are both alumni.
That's right. And so you know what Bucky Badger is.
Yep.
And his
If you
pictures
want
on
to
the
be
cap.
a badger, then come along with me.
Me.
By the bright, shiny light, by the light of the moon.
Yes, you have a better memory for vocals than I do, but that's it.
Well, I guess I was there more recently than you. It was only 50 years ago for me.
Oh, God. More than that for me. I graduated in 1954.
Yeah, I didn't enter until 65.
There you are. Yes.
But it was a very good experience.
Yes, I'm so happy I was able to feature the University of Wisconsin in my memoirs
Mm-hmm.
and bring back some anecdotes and memories that I hope readers will be interested in. So the University of Wisconsin days, that's a theme that really runs through all 50 chapters one way or another. Mhm.
50 chapters.
I know it's 24 chapters too much.
Well, you've had a long life. I was one of the founders, Stan, of the Undergraduate Psychology Student Association at Madison.
Oh, really? Oh,
It was
wow.
formed in 1969. Yeah.
Aha, wow.
I gave a little speech at the formation meeting in which I said I joined the psychology major in order to learn about myself. Instead, all they're teaching is about running rats through mazes. And so they elected me vice president.
Oh, that was a good choice. You have good grief. Well, did you overlap with Harry Harlow's tenure at University of Wisconsin?
Yes, and I met Harry Harlow.
Oh, really? Wow.
I ended up sitting next to him on a Greyhound bus from Chicago to Madison. I was getting on the bus and he stood up and asked me to sit next to him because he had never had a conversation with a long-haired student and he wanted to figure out what I was all about. And
Wow.
his advice to me was get out of psychology.
Wow, really?
Oh, yes. He said he didn't allow any students with long hair in his laboratory. And he also said that he thought maybe I would do well as an art major, but certainly not psychology.
Oh, good heavens.
Well, you kind of blended the two.
Anecdotes, good grief.
Yeah.
You sort of have blended the two, Jeff, with
I sort of have, yeah.
Yeah.
Harry Harlow, was probably the most famous scientist from Wisconsin at the time. He's the guy who tortured little baby monkeys and became famous for it in his research.
Oh, goodness.
I mean, his research would never be approved by an IRB these days.
No, but it made him famous because he showed that the little baby monkeys preferred to hug a teddy bear rather than to go for a bottle of milk, that they needed physical comfort. But in order to demonstrate that, he had to deprive them.
Yeah, we've come a long way, baby. People used to sometimes think that, quote, animals didn't have any emotions, so or feelings.
Yeah. Well, I suppose to his credit, he showed that they did.
Yeah. We have some people here who are saying they are graduates of the University of Wisconsin and saying, go Buckies. We have Dr. Debbie Jaffe Ellis, who says, hello, dear Jeff and Stan, and she'll be presenting. Oh, you'll be presenting together with her at the APA in 6 days.
Yes.
Yeah. So she says hello. All right.
Well, it looks like we're just about ready to start. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our live stream. I'm Jeffrey Meshlove. I'm with the New Thinking Aloud co-host, Emmy Vadnais, and our special guest today, Dr. Stanley Krippner. Stan has been a good friend now for many, many decades. We have, I think, at least 15 prior interviews with him on the New Thinking Aloud channel, covering a wide variety of topics, everything from dream telepathy and healing and shamanism to post-traumatic disorders. And so welcome, Stan. We've got many questions coming in already from our viewers. Here's one from Caw Valley Kid, who wonders about your memories of Elmer Green and his son, Doug Boyd.
Well, of course, I remember Evergreen College very well. It was very, very innovative in its day, decades ago. And I actually was able to appear on campus for an interview and was very, very impressed by the faculty and also by the students. It was very, very pioneering enterprise. And I'm always happy to hear from somebody who was actually there at the time.
Stan, I think you might have misheard me. The question was about Elmer Green.
Elmer Green, oh my God. All right, Elmer Green, not Evergreen College. Well, yeah. Elmer Green, as you know, lived to be about 100 years of age. And we went way back decades because he was able to institute a program on self-regulation, biofeedback, and meditation at the Menninger Foundation and the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. And he and his colleague, Peter Park, actually began treating people with those new therapies. And then he actually organized a yearly event at White Memorial Camp near Topeka that I attended for many, many years, where he would bring people together who were interested in the topic of self-regulation. Back in those days, psychologists did not believe that one's internal processes could be monitored and changed. And Elmer Green, much to his credit, pointed out, yes, you use meditation, biofeedback, neurofeedback, a number of other procedures, and you can actually make a change in the brain and the way that the brain is functioning. Great contribution on his part. And he and his wife, Elise, were wonderful hosts at that annual conference. So I hope that that answers the question. I'm sorry I misunderstood it. But yes, it's always a pleasure to talk about Elmer Green and to run into people who knew him.
Stan, I'd like to ask a follow-up question. In case you're familiar with the book that Elmer wrote about Elise as she was going through Alzheimer's, he called it the Ozaki Book of the Dead. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yes, Elmer wrote a book about Elise and the Alzheimer's, saying Alzheimer's is not what you think it is. And he was able to give examples how Elise was still functioning better than people gave her credit for, depending on how the question was asked and making it easier for her to respond. And so I think that that book is often a roadmap for people whose loved ones are imbued with Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm.
I got the impression from that book that he thought she was sort of traveling back and forth between the worlds. And that's what Alzheimer's represented.
You know, this is all very true. I have close relatives who died from Alzheimer's related diseases. And I remember instances where they did alternate back and forth. So in my communications with them, I tried to wait till a window of opportunity opened where they could interact with me the way that they used to interact.
Emmy?
Well, yes, I've had a couple close relatives with Alzheimer's as well. So that's probably why you're saying my name, Jeff. And I've witnessed the same thing where it seems that they drift into this seemingly reality or dimension and to another. And I agree. I noticed, like you said, Stan, that I appreciated, of course, the moments where they were with me, but also sort of marveled when I would see them sometimes even sort of staring off into the distance as though they were in some other dimension. And I would just be as loving and patient as I could with them.
Well, you did the right thing. And this brings us back to a very fundamental issue. For example, I think that, and I'm not the only one, that consciousness is primary, what Paul Tillich called the ground of being. And when consciousness is primary, it makes it easier to understand how people with Alzheimer's can drift in and out of their contact with consciousness being fundamental and its related phenomenon. So I think that the question about Alzheimer's can be viewed within a larger context in terms of consciousness producing the brain rather than the brain producing consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question from a viewer called Red Pill Junkie. And he's asking, Stan, if you've ever met the Mexican scientist, Dr. I guess it would be pronounced Jacobo Grinberg, who, like you, was very interested in the study of shamans and investigated the alleged powers of Pachita, a famous Mexican healer.
Well, I'm certainly familiar with him and his work with Pachita. And again, I'm sure that very few of your viewers and listeners know who Doña Pachita was, but she was a famed and very, very controversial Mexican healer. And I did have some friends who actually witnessed her healing. You see, what she was purportedly able to do, people would come with a serious ailment and their physicians had given up on them. And Pachita, according to her supporters, was able to open up the body, take out a diseased item or organ, and then replace it with something that was healthy that she allegedly had procured illegally from corpses. It's just such a fantastic story, it makes it hard to believe. But Alberto Violo, one of my former students, who is now very, very prominent in the field of consciousness research, viewed Teresita firsthand, and he actually saw her do this. But then my dear friend Montague Ullman went to see her, and he was able to get some tissue with the material that Pachita was supposedly extracting from the body, and Monty had the samples analyzed, and it was not human blood, it was pig's blood. So here were two very, very different positions on Pachita, and Monty and Alberto actually got together at one point to see what they agreed on, what they disagreed on. Very, very fascinating dialogue. I wish it had been presented. So, Pachita, of course, was never adequately studied at that time, a great loss. So, from my point of view, being agnostic on the topic, it's just one of those missed opportunities for parapsychology. But you know, parapsychology is what we call a poverty science. Not much money, a lot of demand, a lot of projects. And so for somebody to do a proper study of somebody in a distant country, distant land, that would have required a budget that nobody could come up with at the time.
Regarding Dr. Jacobo Grinberg, to the best of my recollection, he died under mysterious circumstances. I wonder if you know anything further about that.
All that I know is that his passing was controversial for one reason or another, but no, I don't have an easy answer to that question. I wish I did. There are so many questions like that in our field, and many unanswered questions that all we can do is to make a note of this and hope that someplace, sometime down the road, there will be a better answer.
I hope so. Thank you, Stan.
Stan, here's a question for you from Mr. Black, who asks, what, in your opinion, are the next best steps for dream ESP research to progress? Where and what should we look at?
Have to repeat that. Where and what should we do what?
Should we look at?
Dream research, dream ESP research.
Oh, good heavens. You ask what we should look for. First of all, we should look for money. Dream research is expensive. And our work at Maimonides, which covered about a decade from start to finish, produced a large number of articles, a monograph, and a book. So everything we did was on record. And you ask what we should look for. I think that our protocol at Maimonides has not been seriously challenged over the years. So go back and look at the safeguards and also the methods of encouragement that were used. And so when you say what should be looked for, make sure that the ambiance is supportive of the dreamer with professed psychic abilities, and be sure that the people who are working with the dreamer are supported. Now, you might think that this is common sense, but going back to our work at Maimonides, our so-called star subject, Robert Vandercastle, the dream researcher himself, did very, very well in our studies. And then Dr. Gardner Murphy, famed psychologist, was able to secure funding for a replication study with David Foulkes and his group at the University of Wyoming. And so Bob went there, and he said that the students who were working with them were not supported. It was all very mechanical. And worse yet, the target pool of pictures, where he had to choose the picture most similar to his dreams, was very poorly. He did several nights at the laboratory, having dreams very, very close to the randomly selected target. And then it come down to one night that would have tipped the balance in terms of replication. And the target pool had two pictures of young people in an environment. And that was Bob Vandercastle's dream. How would he know which of the two he should select? He selected the wrong one, and that prevented another claim for replication. Bob never got over that, and I don't blame him. And in material that he kept writing, he noted this and gave examples of his hits, and then the very unfortunate overlap with target pictures. So there are lessons to be learned from that for anybody who wants to do dream telepathy experiments. Good question.
Here's a question from Andrei Slavash-Krasowski, one of our regular live stream viewers, who asks, what, in your opinion, are the greatest achievements of parapsychology?
Well, that's another good question. And I would say that there are a couple of achievements. Of course, the first achievement is taking reports of psychic phenomena and finding a way for those reports to be scientifically studied. And they can be scientifically studied in several ways. One way is through a formal experiment, the way that we worked at Maimonides, for example, but there are literally dozens of other outstanding experiments, well designed. And so parapsychology also focused on more phenomenological studies, where the reports from people could be subjected to content analysis and studied that way. So, number one achievement in parapsychology is finding a way to scientifically study these reports of puzzling phenomena like telepathy, clairvoyance, and the precognition and the like. And I think the second achievement, parapsychology actually pioneered several methodological improvements, not only for parapsychology, but for psychology as a whole. For example, early on, parapsychology developed a means of presenting a protocol before the experiment started, putting it on record, and so that it couldn't be changed, and post-experimental hypotheses were not permitted. And this type of clearance is done nowadays in parapsychology at the University of Edinburgh. They actually have a system of reviewing proposed experiments and then putting them on record. So that was one methodological improvement that's now being copied by other branches of the social sciences as well. I think that whether one actually is convinced that psychic phenomena occur at all can still admire the methodological improvements that parapsychology brought to the entire field.
Thank you.
Dan, we have a question from Jean Fox, who is wanting to hear about your upcoming memoir book and is wondering what topics it will cover and what are some of the highlights of it.
Well,
Here, I'll share a
a
picture.
little over 2 years ago, I had a request from Park Street Press. They wanted me to write an autobiography. And I didn't think anybody would be interested in my life story. So I had shipped all of my records to my archives at the University of West Georgia. So I needed some help with a couple of chapters, and I sent them to a friend of mine, and I said, please check this for accuracy. He took one look at the 2 chapters and said, I'm a reader for University of Professors Press, and we want that book. We want that autobiography. I said, well, you have to clear that with Park Street Press first. And I really am not sure why Park Street Press very graciously gave the opportunity to Professors Press. They might be happy that they did, because the book became so long, 50 chapters, 2 volumes, that I just hope we can find some people to read it. And so in the memoirs, I call them memoirs rather than autobiography, because there are certain topics I simply was not permitted to include in the record for one reason or another. So I did the best with what I could, and I hope I've come up with some accounts and some interesting stories that people will be able to wade through the book and enjoy and appreciate.
Mhm.
And so that's the story about a chaotic life. I called it a chaotic life in deference to chaos theory, which I've been interested in for many, many years. And in chaos theory, it has many, many postulates. One of them is a change in initial conditions can produce a number of unanticipated results. And this goes beyond mere cause and effect in a linear, rational approach. In chaos theory, things are often nonlinear, and you never know how things are out. For example, when I was maybe 10 or 11 years of age, I had a premonition that my uncle, Max Munson, had died. He was in good health. Why did I have such a premonition? And as I was getting that premonition, my mother downstairs was screaming, and what's the problem, Mother? Your Uncle Max has just died. Well, he was a young man. He died suddenly of a heart attack. So that's what got me interested in parapsychology. And I began to read popular information on the topic. And there was a radio show, The Amazing Dunninger, who was a mentalist who did such things as identify personal details of people in the audience, predicting a newspaper headline a week in advance, other such feats. And when I was at the University of Wisconsin, and it was head of the Speakers Bureau, I thought, wouldn't it be nice to invite Dunninger to speak and perform? And somebody on the committee said, don't you realize he's a mentalist? Everything he does is sleight of hand. I looked into it. He was right. I have been long a student of magic and an amateur magician myself. And so I could have how he did those amazing feats for entertainment. So then my philosophy professor, Campbell Garnett, was telling us about how parapsychological phenomena were being studied at university by J.B. Ryan and his group. And so that's what catapulted me into exploring the scientific ways to study these phenomena. So there you have it.
Thank you, Stan. We have a question here from your friend and my friend, Sidian Jones, who asks, have you seen the recent news on UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena? And if so, what do you think about it?
You know, this is a good question because until very recently, parapsychologists stayed away from the studying of unidentified aerial phenomena for logical reasons. Parapsychology is controversial the way it is, and to take on another controversial topic would just be more than the traffic could bear. However, with the new congressional hearings on record, this has stimulated a few parapsychologists to trace some possible connections between ufologists, students of unidentified aerial phenomena, and its interaction with parapsychological phenomena. Now, there is a major difference. I think that the evidence for parapsychology is much, much stronger than the evidence for unidentified aerial phenomena. There is now a public hearing, questions for many, many people. The Pentagon is still adamant in saying that they're not convinced that these are unusual in the scheme of things. And so while that debate is going on, I think that all that I can say to parapsychologists is, yes, keep yourself informed. Just don't bite off more than you can chew or jump to conclusions, because parapsychology is controversial the way it is, and its opponents, the pseudo-skeptics, will jump at any chance that they can find to discredit the field. I should mention in passing, Sidian Jones has written a wonderful book called My Mythos, in which he's taken the concept of personal mythology and has made it available to people who follow his instructions in the book. And he also has My Mythos for Children, which brings it into an arena that children and young adults can appreciate. His work for children is so remarkable that it's actually being used by trauma specialists in Ukraine who are working with children. So any of you who want to check that out, just go to the internet. There you have it under My Mythos, Mythos, and you're in for a great surprise. Long answer, but that was a very remarkable question.
Okay, I've got a question here from MC Cool Garter or something like that, or Gur Doctor. Stanley, give your comments on the universe being a simulation and how psychology is as much important as hard empirical physics for the existence of the universe.
Well, again, number of parapsychologists have noted that some of the postulates of quantum physics and the like actually are similar to what are being studied by parapsychologists, and they have made a link. I want to mention that, as far as I know, one of the first applications was by Alberto Viola and myself in our book Healing States and the Realms of Healing, where we applied quantum physics to the study of parapsychological healing. And then Evan Harris Walker, who is no longer with us, wrote an excellent book. He is a physicist, by the way, where he proposed a theoretical physical perspective to explain parapsychological phenomena. So that work is going on, and we will see where it leads. I'm not a quantum physicist, so I don't make any great claims myself in terms of the proposed entanglement, but other people who know more about it are doing that particular work. So yes, that's a very viable topic right now in parapsychology.
Thank you for that, Stan. I also want to let our viewers know it's close to the bottom of the hour, and we'll be continuing for almost another hour to the bottom of the next hour. I've got a question here from a viewer whose YouTube name is G. Stanley, which sounds like a tip of the hat to a famous psychologist, but I'll move on. Here's his question. What would you advise young people? What is the most important trait to cultivate and the most significant area to focus on?
Well, your caller mentioned G. Stanley, of course, the famous psychologist, G. Stanley Hall, an eminent pioneering psychologist who is in all of the history books for good reason. So that tie-in is quite remarkable. Now, you ask for what advice, you have to realize that I simply do not give advice to people. I discuss the way that I see the world. I discuss what I have found in my research. And this limits advice I can give to people on how to run their lives. Other people have done much better than I can. Joseph Campbell famously said, follow your bliss. More easily said than done. Most people don't have the degrees of freedom to follow their bliss. I write a lot about Alan Watts in my memoirs, very dear friend and very influential. I attended a number of seminars with him. Never once did he give advice to people. He asked questions. He answered questions with his basis in Eastern philosophy and psychology. And that is sort of a role model for me. I can give very global advice to young people. Frankly, I think the most important thing that they are going to be able to face is the problems of climate change. This was not attended to by earlier generations, and now events have caught up with us. Also, I would note that Aldous Huxley was asked when he was dying what advice he would have for the world, and he said, "I just wish people could be a little kinder to each other." I think that's a great comment, and I would certainly endorse it. We have a lack of kindness, not only in our country, in the world at large, and kindness goes back, of course, to some of the great religious and philosophical traditions like Buddhism, and also variations in Christianity, numerous others. And so some people are spooked out when they say we must love each other. The word love has so much baggage in it, but more easily comprehended is the concept of kindness and empathy and compassion, and how we can cultivate that in our own lives. So, hope that helps to answer the question.
Yes. It makes me think of, it echoes, I think, what Jeffrey Mishlove often says is when you resolve to become the best version of yourself, that there will be forces in the universe that will come to assist you, and that also people can experience what are referred to as parapsychological experiences when one does that, to let them know they're on the right path, perhaps.
Yes, indeed. I think that one scenario that I fantasize is that people in mainstream psychology, with the advent of artificial intelligence, etc., will run into phenomena that are parapsychological nature, but they will give it a different name and will claim the discovery, sort of putting parapsychology on the side because that would give it a bad name. Well, I doubt that that will happen, but if it did, I would say, all right, let's go along with it. Let's hope that somebody now is willing to chart new territory and develop new maps.
Mm-hmm. There's actually a question here from Phil O. Sophia, who says, would you not agree that all is consciousness? Therefore, isn't it reasonable to suggest that all intelligences, even AI, are already an extension of consciousness? And then they put in all caps, all is conscious, all is one.
Well, I think your caller put it very, very well. And yes, what he says or she said does make sense to me. So just go for it. That's a theme that's very, very worthwhile to develop. Absolutely.
Here's a question from our mutual friend, Dr. Debbie Jaffe Ellis, who asks if you would share with us some things about the impact of Albert Ellis in your life.
Oh, good heavens. Well, in my memoirs, I devote a bit of time, actually quite a bit of time, to Albert Ellis, who was very influential in my life. I've been attending meetings of the American Psychological Association for decades. And I was still in graduate school at Northwestern University when I went to APA. And I think there was 1960. I think the place was Chicago, Illinois. And Albert Ellis gave a talk about what he was calling rational therapy. This is a deviation from psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy. And as I listened to him, it was an epiphany. What he said just made so much sense to me. And of course, this is the beginning of what we now call cognitive and behavioral therapy. Now, I'm not a psychotherapist, so I don't have any axes to grind or any agenda. It's just that when I heard Albert Ellis speak about what became rational emotive behavior therapy, it made great sense to me. And so I actually attended a weekend seminar with him in New York City, and that's when I actually had the chance to interact with him face to face. Marvelous seminar. I learned so much from it. And then he began sending me taped sessions of how he put his type of therapy to use with clients. Good heavens, I was a nobody, just a graduate student. Why is he paying such extravagant attention to me? And as the years went by, I had more interactions with Al. He was actually a pioneer in humanistic psychology and he was the secretary for the newly formed division of humanistic psychology in APA. And as the years went by, I attended more seminars with him. I had more interaction with him. And I was the program chair for an international conference on humanistic psychology in the Netherlands. And I invited Al to speak, much to my surprise. He agreed, even though his way was not being paid, but it did give him and his proposal some international exposure that I hope was helpful. More recently, I actually did a joint workshop with Albert Ellis in Mexico. And it was an excellent opportunity for students, but the university that sponsored the talk told its students, don't bother to pay her money. Albert Ellis and Stanley Krippner are too famous to come to our university. At the last minute, they'll send a replacement. Well, of course, that was a lie. We showed up. We had 100 people in the seminar. We should have had 500 people, and the university professors just spoiled it. But it gave me a wonderful chance to interact with Al. I even was able to do some translations for him. All of this he mentioned in his wonderful autobiography, All Out, which in some ways was a model for my own more modest A Chaotic Life memoirs. So anyway, we did our best for the 100 students, got a lot of praise, a lot of strokes that went very, very well. Several years later, Debbie Ellis and I were invited to do a program in Mexico. And again, the invitational people messed it up. They didn't give it proper attention. We had 24 people in the audience. We should have had 10 times that many. So all I can say is, historically, I'm probably the only person in the world who has done a joint seminar with Albert Ellis, another joint seminar with Debbie Jaffe Ellis. And so for that, I am grateful. And if folks want to learn more about my interaction with Albert Ellis, it's all in my memoirs. And in the meantime, I'm delighted that Debbie Jaffe Ellis is carrying on the tradition, because rational emotive behavior therapy is very humanistic and gives very good advice that I have followed. For example, accept yourself the way you are, accept others the way they are, accept the world the way you are. Once you start out with acceptance, then you can go about making changes. But you have to have the acceptance first. Interestingly enough, Carl Rogers, another friend of mine, said the same thing for his client-centered, person-centered psychotherapy. He and Albert Ellis were miles apart, even though the two of them are ranked near the top in polls of most influential psychologists of all time. And the fact that both of them started on the basis of self-acceptance really says a lot. And again, if I were to give advice, I would say, go and read about self-acceptance in one of Albert Ellis's many, many books, and go on from there. Okay, I think that's the best I can do for a brief discussion of Albert Ellis. Yes, very, very influential in my life, sure.
Stan, let me ask a follow-up question to that, because I've also enjoyed interviewing Albert Ellis, but he had a reputation as being rather hostile to parapsychology. And I wonder how he accepted, for example, your work in that field.
Well, of course, he was hostile to parapsychology because it sort of violated his worldview. In the first place, I would say he mellowed a little bit toward the end of his life, become more open to the possibilities. But when we were both in New York City, he actually invited me to present my work on dream telepathy at his institute, which I was happy to do. And so he was broad-minded enough, and this is to his credit, of having somebody discuss parapsychology at his institute. And he invited me out for dinner after the talk was over. He thought the talk went very well, because when I present on the topic, I'm always a bit circumspect and tell people, well, this is one of the problems in the field. These are some of the false accusations in the field. So where do we go from here? So my approach, I think, is a bit more modest than what some of my colleagues would do. But I think the net reflection and the net results have been worth it.
I also really like what you said about people accepting themselves. And that seems to be one of the opportunities in the world and in our relationships, is that we tend to, when we don't like or love ourselves, that we can be critical to ourselves and critical to others. And so by being more accepting of ourselves, we can then be kinder to ourselves and kinder to others as well.
Well, that's a good way to put it. And one of the first books I read by Albert Ellis was Sex Without Guilt. And what an anecdote that was for many, many people who did not accept themselves, who did not accept their sexuality in one way or another. And that book was very, very liberating for many, many people.
Yeah, a lot of people, there's a whole movement of people embracing their sexuality and gender identity, and people coming out of the closet, if you will, and embracing that part in our culture, at least here in America. We tend to, at one hand, suppress sexuality or our sexual urges, and on the other hand, want to embrace it more. So there seems to be a conflict within the collective psyche, although maybe that's changing.
Oh, good heavens, you are so right. I tell in my memoirs about my friendship with Harry Benjamin, who was an early pioneer in the studies of what's now called transgender people, in those days, transsexual people. And I actually was able to interview some of his clients, including some of the clients who had surgery done to enhance their perceived identity. And I even went so far, I can remember one of the post-operative people was so eager to show off her new body that the surgeon and I actually examined her nude body, her artificially created vagina, her lack of breasts, all of that. And I think that Harry Benjamin's advice is worth considering these days. I actually worked with a transgender person in Mexico years ago, and I followed his advice. Number one, you spend a year cross-dressing and dressing in the mode of your preferred identity. Then you spend another year passing, going, interacting with people so that you're very, very comfortable for your new sexual identity. And then in the third year, you can start talking about surgery and follow-up. This is in stark contrast, back in those days, the people who didn't want to wait 3 years, they would go to Casablanca. There was an excellent team of surgeons who would remove the breasts, create an artificial vagina, or on the other hand, to enhance the breasts and to create an artificial penis. All of that was done very, very skillfully, but without the preparation or the follow-up that Harry Benjamin advised. And so I'm observing now the conflict in our culture. Transgender people, less than 1% of the population, yet getting huge amounts of political coverage. And I just sort of watch it with great, great interest. And we'll see where it all ends up.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question, Stan, from a viewer whose YouTube name is Ja Universe, who says, "Dear Stanley Krippner, have you seen or heard of paranormal phenomena in or through music?"
Paranormal phenomena in music?
Yes.
Good heavens. Well, first of all, there's a close connection between parapsychological phenomena and music. All of this was the topic of a study done years ago by Scott Rogel. And it still has not been adequately explored, and it should be, because if you take a look at the way that the brain functions, and most of you know this, the so-called left brain, at least for right-handed people, is more verbal. The so-called left hemisphere of the brain, more musical and nonverbal. And I said for right-handed people, things switch for left-handed people. And then if you're a speaker of Japanese, Chinese, etc., changes very dramatically because there's not that much distance between right and left hemisphere functions, because those languages are built upon what was originally nature sounds. So these phenomena, to get back to the question, argue for a greater use of music and a careful monitoring of music. And music plays such an important role in altered states of consciousness and their cultivation that we don't want to miss out on possible applications to parapsychology as well. A couple of experiments that I did with Maimonides Medical Center were not with nighttime dreams, but daytime fantasies. And we had the participants listening to music as they were getting the image of the distant target. Again, there are so many things in parapsychology that deserve follow-up. The tie-in with music is certainly one of them.
I know your experiment with the Grateful Dead in the context of dream telepathy research has mostly been described in terms of the telepathic senders being under the influence of psychedelic drugs, but they were also under the influence of the music.
Well, that's a good tie-in, and again, for your viewers who aren't familiar with this, years ago, Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead said, you know, we're going to do a series of 6 concerts in Long Island. Why don't we do one of your dream telepathy experiments? And so I designed a protocol that worked out very, very well. And the night of the concert, one of our assistants was on the scene, was in the control booth, and as the Grateful Dead began to play, he flipped a coin. There were 2 sequences, and the coin would determine which target picture would be used. So after the Dead had been playing for an hour or so, the captions appeared on the screen, "You are about to participate in an ESP experiment." And then they gave the instructions, try sending the image to Malcolm Bessant, who was a psychic from England, who was in the dream laboratory. And so they complied. The audience, of course, for the most part, were in altered states of consciousness themselves, from marijuana or from mushrooms or some other psychedelic. And it really worked out remarkably well. and we got statistically significant results when outside judges tried to match the picture with the night of dreaming. And this was simply an interesting pilot study. Of course, we published it right away. And to this day, that is the one study of our work at Maimonides that's gotten the most coverage and the most publicity. Again, never would have expected that in 50 years to the week, there was another concert at that same venue, and they had saved all of the ticket receipts from several decades earlier and invited people to come back to one of the concerts. And again, this was not a formal experiment. It was done just for fun. But it was interesting that 50 years down the road, people are still talking about that very, very pioneering study. And again, music was certainly at the center of that. So thank you for reminding me, Jeff. Absolutely.
Yeah. Also, let me remind our viewers, we're just about at the top of the hour, a couple minutes past. We'll be continuing for 28 more minutes till we get to the bottom of the hour.
Great. Stan, thank you for all that you're sharing so far. Just to dovetail on that question about music, we have a question here from another incredible musician, Stephen Halpern. And he asks, you were one of the Americans at the 1973 Kirlian Photography Conference. You brought back the schematics to build a device, enabling me to do my work. Can you talk about that?
Oh, good heavens. Stephen Halpern is a pioneer in his own right. His wonderful CDs of music are sold all over the world. And we have a long relationship that goes way back. And one very, very interesting experiment we did was with Kirlian photography. Again, your viewers probably have never heard of Kirlian photography. Semyon and Valentina Kirlian were two Russian inventors. And they did a very simple experiment, taking a roll of photographic film, putting metals on top of it, running a discharge through it, and that would determine whether the metal was in stress and danger of breaking or not. Very, very practical application. But remember, this is during the New Age days. Some people, including my friend Thelma Moss of UCLA, brought news of the Kirlian photography, and immediately the popular press said, well, this is photographing the human aura. Good heavens. Way overstated. But back to Stephen Halpern, he did an experiment with Kirlian photography and music, which is very pioneering. And I mentioned that in my memoirs, and it really deserves more of a write-up in its own right. Yes, back decades ago, Stephen Halpern did a good job on this. And again, your listeners and viewers might be well advised to check out one of Stephen's CDs, Music for Any Occasion. Let me tell you, quite a library. So that's the Kirlian photography story. So what's happened to Kirlian photography down the road? It actually has gone through a number of iterations, and there is now an adaptation of it that its backers think can predict the course of an illness or outcome. A while back, we talked about photographing the human aura. No, the Russians said the human aura, if there is such a thing, is so subtle and so fragile, running electrical current through the film would destroy the aura. One of the incongruities of that particular topic.
Anything further on that, Stan?
This is such a complicated topic. I devote an entire chapter in my memoirs and also trace the publications from the Soviet Union where Kirlian photography was used. And it got to the point where we actually held a conference on Kirlian photography in New York City, sponsored by Judith Scott Whitson and her foundation. We brought in some key people to talk about not only Kirlian photography, but acupuncture, aura perception, etc. Very wild phenomena. Filled the house. Did it again the next year. Filled the house again. So all the proceedings of those conferences are available in a book that Daniel Rubin and I edited on the proceedings. Okay, so thank heavens, I like to record and document everything I've done. And so those conferences, for whatever interest people might have, are now documented in those two books. Yes.
I've got a question here from a viewer whose YouTube name is Blanking Question. Interesting names people are able to create on YouTube. And he asks, or she asks, Stanley, is there value in Western astrology? And can you tell us your sun, moon, and rising signs, or anything interesting about your natal chart?
Yes, I have had my chart drafted a couple of times. And I think what your viewer would find most interesting, if there is a grand triune in my chart, which is very bad news because it indicates a life stressor that is very, very hard to work around. So again, I'm not advocating astrology one way or not. However, I hope they're right because I've had so much stress, so much anxiety, so many problems in my life. To blame it on my grand triune is an easy way out. Not that I would take it, but it would be the easy way out, yes. I'm glad the question said Western astrology because there's also Eastern psychology, not Eastern astrology and Western astrology. Eastern astrology is quite different. And then for all psychologies, keep in mind that the astrology goes back literally thousands of years. And within that space of time, the planet conjunctions have shifted. So we're actually one step away from what it was back when astrology was first founded. So again, it's interesting for me to just follow the controversy, follow the literature. And yes, I do mention that briefly in my memoirs. But in all frankness, I've never quite found my charts and their interpretations to be of much help in terms of planning my future. For better or for worse, yes, they talk a lot about the past and very, very skimpy on the future. One of them produced advice which was dead wrong. And I'm glad I didn't take it too seriously. Okay.
Mhm. So here's a question from Sheila Roher, and they start out with a statement, which could maybe also be a question for you. Symbolic language and imagery is key to parapsychology and shamanism and astrology, which you were just talking about. So maybe the question could be, do you feel that symbolic language and imagery is key to parapsychology? And then they ask, do you see any change in Western science's willingness to value symbolic language?
Do I think that what?
Do you see any change in Western science's willingness to value symbolic language?
Oh, good heavens, yes. Science is changing very, very slowly, but yes, I can see it change. For example, parapsychology is getting a much more respectful audience right now than it was a few decades ago. And I think that the paradigm shift that's taking place right now does pay special attention to non-symbolic communication. And the questioner brought up the topic of shamanism. Well, that, of course, is a whole episode of my life and my contact with shamans, notably Rolling Thunder, the intertribal medicine man I worked with for 20 years, but others as well. And when you get into the shamanic worldview, you get into realms that very rarely involve a lot of language, a lot of symbolism, yes. And shamans over the ages have been very, very masterful at creating symbols and images that are helpful for the people who they're attempting to treat. I visited Rolling Thunder's group several years ago, and he wanted me to hypnotize one of his clients, a young man who came his way because he was severely alcoholic. And so once I hypnotized him, I had him visualize images rather than words. This is the non-symbolic language you're talking about. And focusing on feelings and taste and smells. And it seems to have worked out quite well in terms of getting him off alcohol and for him to abstain from alcohol. So I think that the work I've done with shamans is interesting because many things that shamans were doing were back in the days that there was no adequate vocabulary to express them. In fact, the acquisition of language is fairly recent in terms of human evolution. And at some point in time, people had feelings, they had emotions, they had dreams, even before they were able to describe them in language.
I think the questioner was asking about symbolic language And of course, you addressed the issue of non-symbolic language. We had another questioner earlier who was asking about Eric Fromm. And if I recall correctly, Eric Fromm wrote the book on the forgotten language of dreams, which would be symbolic. And so I guess what I'm getting at is there's a role for both.
Oh, good heavens. Gee, I didn't hear that very critical word, symbolic, non-symbolic. I gave a good answer, but it was for the wrong question. I'm very, very sorry. Now, the book that you mentioned about dreams, yes, very important book because it shows how dreams operate in symbols. So let me just take a minute or two to talk about that. Dreams serve a number of functions, and dreams are still not completely understood. But one of the main functions that they serve is to process information, process feelings, process information. All of that is best done in symbols, not in words, because the symbol can pull together a number of strands from a person's life, and in terms of efficiency, put them all together in a useful package that is useful to the person, whether they remember the dream or not. So the symbolism in dreams has spurred the production of so-called dream dictionaries, where it takes a symbol such as water and saying, well, this refers to life before birth. Oh, that's nonsense. Each person has his or her own symbol system in dreams. Back thousands of years ago, when there were tightly formed communities, yes, in those instances, the symbols meant the same thing for everybody in the tribe. Now we're in a position where there's so much input from cultures all over the world that if you want to use a dream dictionary, I tell people, create your own. Monitor your dreams, and as soon as you find a recurring symbol that means something, make a note of it. So that would be an important consideration, again, for many of your viewers and listeners. Writing down your dream on a notebook, on a computer file, whatever, that can give you a record that can you back and check retroactively and see if the symbol had a follow-up in one's own personal life.
That is great advice. And since you're going to be releasing your memoirs soon, we have a question here from Travis Wade Zinstan, who asks, what is the most remarkable parapsychological experience you've had personally?
Oh, good heavens, there have been so many. The premonition of my Uncle Max's death would certainly be one of them. Also, when I was part of the psilocybin research project at Harvard University, I had an image that President Kennedy would be assassinated. And again, unfortunately, that came to pass not too many months after I had the image. And so that was another remarkable experience. I think that the work that we did at Maimonides certainly qualifies. And I always volunteered to be a part of an experiment before we brought in volunteers, just in case things went wrong, and to test out telepathy feature. I was a subject myself, and I had many, many dreams, the most vivid being one that I was at the edge of a precipice and was about to fall into the void. Well, of course, this would be symbolic of many things in one's personal life, but the picture that was being concentrated on was exactly that. It was a steep cliff and a precipice that I was viewing. Exactly what I dreamed about. So that was quite remarkable. So those are a few things that come immediately to mind. I think that from my own perspective, I don't consider myself as being unduly psychic. I have probably just as much or just as little psychic capacity as anybody. But the difference is that I record these examples and then I record them so I can put them to use in my own research.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, Stan, do you feel that everybody has an ability to access their psychic intuitive functioning, or do you think some people have more of a natural ability, or is it just that it's not as emphasized for people to develop or really get in touch with this innate part of themselves?
Well, in psychology, we talk about human traits following a bell-shaped curve. For example, intellectual intelligence. There are some people at the extreme end who are extremely intelligent and who go on to make great scientific and intellectual discoveries with that intelligence. At the other end are people who have virtually no intelligence at all. When I was working in Richmond, Virginia, I was taken to a home and taken to see a boy by the name of Jamie, and he had a measured IQ of about 5 or 10. The only thing he was able to do was to follow a light beam going back and forth in front of his eyes. And so there are people who are at the low end of the intellectual scale. Most people then are in the middle. Well, so it goes in psychic phenomena. And should we say psychic phenomena reports, because then we don't have to defend the posture that these things actually are real. At one extreme, people who've had no psychic experiences, who don't do well on exams. On the other hand, we have the psychic virtuosos like Robert Vandercastle, I mentioned. And most of us fall in the middle. And so again, the normal distribution curve is useful, and it prevents us from making offhand comments that simply are wrong. So when we say that everybody is able to describe these experiences, not true. People at the low end of the scale don't have the language acquisition skill to able to do it. So that's by looking at the big picture is so important when studying these phenomena.
Here's a question from a viewer whose YouTube name is Lennon Silva. It's a complicated question. I know we have only 5 minutes left, so Let's see if you can handle it. He says, would you share your thoughts and insights on how we may have an objective account of consciousness given its subjective nature?
I didn't get the last part. Just repeat that.
Yeah, given the subjective nature of consciousness,
Yeah.
how is it going to be possible to develop an objective science or an account of it?
Oh, yes. Okay. Because you're running out of time, I'll suggest that your viewers and listeners go to the TKI website, the Krippner Institute website, and this is where I put, and other people put, a lot of information for questions like this. So, consciousness, of course, is elusive. That's why psychologists were afraid to touch the topic for several decades, because they didn't see how it could be studied behaviorally. I would say now we have the instruments, the technology, and the concepts to take reports of psychic phenomena and study them in useful ways. No, they never completely capture the experience itself. The word is not the territory, to quote Albert Korzybski in General Semantics. The written description does not completely cover the experience itself. Realize that and move on. We do the best with the tools that we have. And again, to answer that question, we're in a much better position now than we were decades ago. And consciousness research is now being studied literally all over the world. There is an annual Science of Consciousness conference, and I've been to several myself. And most of the leading people in the field attend those conferences and discuss these topics, and to the point where I think it's safe to say, yes, there actually is a science of consciousness. It hasn't solved a lot of problems, such as the so-called hard problem, how people actually experience concepts such as the color red, such as love and compassion, such as anxiety, etc. But we do the best that we can with the tools we have available. And I think that after all these years, the science of consciousness is finally off to a good start, producing information. And now the psychedelic renaissance has changed the map. I know of half a dozen universities who actually have training programs on how to be a psychedelic guide. Well, parapsychology enters into this. What do you do with people who have a purported psychic experience? The psychedelic guide has to be sure not to discount those, to be more accepting of them. And I think that this will provide another piece of the puzzle in terms of parapsychology. And a couple of years hence, I think we'll have much more of a database on these type of experiences.
Thank you, Stan. It's been a real pleasure to share the last 90 minutes with you and with my co-host, Emmy Vadnais. It's always a great joy to be with you. I'm looking forward to the release of your book, A Chaotic Life, which I guess is scheduled for October. So hopefully we'll be doing another interview with you then about that book.
Okay, thank you both very, very much. You made my task much easier by your very, very careful repetition of those questions. Thank you both.
And thank you both for your contributions to parapsychology. It's a true blessing for all of us to have both of you here together with all of us today.
And one final note, let me remind our viewers about the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series published by White Crow Books. And this is the very first book in that series, Is There Life After Death?
I endorse that. And I have a copy of Jeff's prize-winning essay on the topic. And congratulations on that, Jeff, and you've opened the door for serious consideration of the topic of life after death for untold numbers of people with that essay and other essays too.
Thank you, Stan. And for those of you who have been with us for the last 90 minutes, thank you, because you are the reason that we are here.